Hello everyone, a brief consideration today on historical objectivity, as some of you ask, but how can history be objective, and or how can I look at history objectively, depending on essentially what you refer to history like, right, in which perspective. History it's like science, right? From one side it can be a method, an activity, an inquiry or research. On the other hand, it can be the sum of the acknowledgments that we derive from this process. And it's one of those topics that you can't really cover briefly or just looking at them comprehensively, because as most things, it's a simpler question to answer than it seems, because the simple answer is actually making or studying history, right? So I realized that most people can't really do it the way it would be proper. So is there another way? Fundamentally, no, right? Like for any other thing, you can't be an expert engineer if you don't study engineering. You can't be an expert doctor if you don't study medicine, you don't practice it. Everything is connected to this direct exposure, this proper activity and proper action, right? That brings you with brings together with it all the knowledge and properly the know-how of how to learn more and how to perfect your knowledge. And what we do, right, in a broadly abstracted sense, is essentially to refine the knowledge that we should have already acquired in a basic sense, for which in theory education should provide you with, in fact, the basis of. And at that point, dominating, at least within a certain framework, the thought of scholars, of whoever wrote about a specific topic, and in theory also knowing how and where the scholar came from with that information. So making a work that becomes very, in fact, professional in a way. And only at that point, knowing the broader historiographical picture, so many scholars, as a matter of fact, and whoever wrote about that specific subject, starting to not much filling the gaps of what has not been discovered yet, but actually correcting the mistakes that these people have done mentally. Because at the end of the day, the problem is not neurologically, in fact, expanding knowledge, arithmetically, like saying, there is this fog, and we just, dispel it, and we discover new things. This is a very bidimensional and kind of also part very flat and superficial and mostly deterministic and relativistic view of knowledge in general, which is the prevalent one, right? When you're on Google, you search, certain historical events, and you see that people in the automatic search say, facts, right? There is, of course, an obsession for objectivity, but this is search for in the wrong direction, right? If you want facts, essentially you're asking for a sort of pre-packed knowledge that you think for some odd reason should be provided per se by some degree of objectivity. And it's immediately evident that you have to make kind of a hierarchy of that on the base of method, because otherwise, which kind of information, especially the very cheap and superficial one, you can immediately find about practically everything, you can immediately see the point that it's not much that it's not objective, but it's not answering the question, right? And so going in a direction that you understand someone decided to direct you to, rather than actually answering the question, which again is in fact relativism, and what most I think ideologies today are based on, right? It's not important what I can objectively assess on the base of all the evidence I can gather, and kind of cross-sect and realize and trying to understand also what others did with it. And so how this may have possibly influenced a certain view, etc. No, that of course that's a kind of an advance, a pro step that you should be able to take at some point, but in fact it cannot be made by anyone, right? So the first answer would be yes, you should. It's in practical terms, the best way is to trust an authority, to trust a source, to trust someone that you attribute some degree of reliability to, right? Not even necessarily objectivity, because objectivity is naturally a chimera of some sort, given that nothing can be fully objective. But this has nothing to do with the fact that it can be a good amount of objective, right, compared to something else. And so this is not relativism. This is given the acceptation that there is a truth out there, and so that reality, albeit subjective, is not wholly subjective. It's objective and subjective at the same time, because by some level you do nail some point, some truth that you just can't see, because it's stressed with this reality that we cannot ultimately districate in an absolute sense but at the same time, you know that behind that reality there is that truth kind of sustaining it, supporting it, making it in the first place. And so it's very easy also to divert nowadays people by making them believe in, whatever narrative you want, just by essentially playing on their own gullibility, right? And history poses always a lot of problems that it seems to me nowadays, from a cultural point of view, we have stopped kind of trying to analyze and to even confrontate each other on. And part of the reason why politics is very dumb and polarized, and also destructive in that sense, because I think in part it's even a strategy, right, of those who use the dumbest arguments, because maybe the average person believes in those things, but even narrowing, say, dumbing concepts down, it's a strategical policy, especially of leftism, of superstition, of obscurantism, to essentially habituate also the other side to a cheaper, more superficial, and narrower way of thinking. And that's the greatest risk, actually, that we're living today, because in part that derives, say, the left is not a political side per se. It's just the absence of merit, of knowledge, of reason, right? It's the idea that there shouldn't be a hierarchy based on actual values, and so that the more you spread this idea of subjectivity, for which you can't even define things, because you can always say this is not fully objective. Well, what the hell cares? Like, humanity, civilization essentially travels on a degree of approximation, as everything is, like geometry, right? You can't define space or walk, because we base ourselves on invented concepts like the line, the surface, or the point. For what our existence is concerned, of course, we probably don't see too much, but still, by what we consider to be important, still there is a degree of objectivity that we all agree on, conventionally, by a certain standard. And just because there are some ideologies that fundamentally sclerotize in moral absolutism, which is an actual moral relativism, because in the moment in which you do, you're basically eliminating all the rest, and so that makes you a moral relativist anyway. Say, you can always say, again, as always, it's about the half empty or filled glass, right? It's not an interesting idea, right? It's just circling around without getting to any point. How much water there is in that glass, that is the only thing that actually matters. So relativism is a great danger, because especially everybody seems to be habituated to it, right? When I make videos about conservatism, saying history makes you conservative, is because I see in the traditional beliefs, not some sort of relativistic anchor in a world that is changing and that, therefore change just because they are narrowly circumscribed, but because they were concepts that were exactly derived from a comprehensive understanding of reality on a deep moral and scientific reflection that not even the so-called conservatives today actually know anything about, right? Just to put it very bluntly, right? If you are a conservative today, on average, you should just be ashamed of yourself because you're basically a culturally inferior and completely worthless individual that doesn't have any idea of what traditionalism, universalism is, and that the same people that you think you are kind of preserving the values of would have simply spit in your face and they would have been right for the disgusting slob that you actually are. This is for not talking about the other side, but this is the concrete reality, and it's a very objective reality, but nobody wants to hear that, right? Because you feel less, you feel, a failure, whatever. But this is exactly the point, that we have adjusted nowadays the world on some standards that are extremely relaxed, at least in the better world, that is also the one that kind of by osmosis has been civilizing the rest, that, however, for reasons that we cannot explain today, because I will make videos in the future explaining better, has softened up and will soften up the rest as well, right? Unless some other, hopefully not cataclysmic, but likely so anyway, change will trigger the necessity of, again, chaos to be dominated, and so, spurring the spirit and reacquiring that kind of values that are always the same, right? And they're simply ingrained in the reality that we know, again, from a moral and scientific point of view. There is not really an escape from this. And that's why today it's become so difficult to talk about objectivity in the first place, because what the average person is habituated to is always a person saying kind of their own opinion and insisting on it just because it's their own as a validating point, right? Even in their own subjectivity. This is not the point, right? I think a couple of years ago I made a video which was called, is Schwerpunkt historically reliable or something like that, and probably I will make one in the future to explain better this point, because I've had an important amount of new subscribers. Some of you may wonder what I'm doing here. You simply don't know what I've been doing before you came here, and or even I see there are subscribers that follow me for a long time, that sometimes from the comments I realize they haven't quite gotten what I do here and how and why and how everything is interconnected. I must say that the most important thing, of course, to be objective is to dominate a bit everything, but still having kind of one field where you actually know how to go very much in thorough depth and detail, so that you can exercise that kind of activity I was talking about before, that is essentially correcting other people's mistakes about a form of knowledge that, again, is largely, if not correct, but in fact objective, right? It's like with history, but this is a bit, and I would like to make an example at some point with a specific video to explain what it is concretely. You get to the realization that objectivity stems exactly very often from the unknown. I mean, not knowing things makes you much sharper in an objective sense than not knowing things does, right? And it seems to me, in fact, that this is the entire point of the story, is that the reason why you know less is because you're not forced to learn anything, right? Because you live in a state in which you can afford not to make this terrific effort, and therefore you don't see the point of taking things to a next level. If you don't have a strong motivation, just by inclination, of course, some of the same von Clausewitz's avatar I use here and the phone Krieg by itself are say it all, right? This person essentially got through the most devastating series of wars that mankind had ever seen, and came out of it with, not just with an idea, but with a spirit, with a worldview that not just made sense, but was practically based on reality, right? But with a practicality that was, in fact, both moral and scientific. And this effort, this sacrifice, this commitment doesn't exist anymore, because largely there is no reason to make that effort anymore. And that's why, say, moral forces can easily go down, even when you pretend to seem, let's say, particularly knowledgeable, or you have this illusion that you have learned who knows what. But if you look at what science is doing nowadays, or at least from the way it's also disgustingly portrayed by the media, just to mostly back scientific bias, and therefore one of the lowest forms of scientific undereducation, is this sense that everything can be solved after all by technology, first of all, or that this technology is fundamentally the way, or the only way, without even realizing that from a broader cultural point of view, politically, military, or socially, the world is going completely different directions that by themselves are much more powerful than any kind of these technological impact, and simply because technology serves a purpose, it's not created just for the sake of that. The latter idea, in fact, is also what it's been mostly connected with our ethos of just believe in, just be you, and you will be amazing, and everything will go well, right? There'll always be happy endings, and and yeah, we will make it because and without just flattering yourself, right? There is not merit even in kind of wanting a person's good. In other words, not even in love, in a dimension like the idea, for example, of helping someone solve his or her own problems. It should be seen as a as a first duty of any person who cares about another. This is seen today as a kind of attack to the person. You have this passive aggressive reactions being triggered, people getting suspicious, not understanding anymore properly what the purpose of an individual is in a comprehensive sense of this broader cultural reality that, again, always maintains a universal and thus an objectively traceable order, reason, and logic. This is not accepted because we've been teaching that everybody is special, even though they aren't evidently by any standard word like properly what we have civilizationally the word like, and it's kind of obvious because, again, I can't digress today on that specific topic, but that there is no, the main problem being that there is no connection, or just not immediately visible connection or pressuring connection, because that's also a thing that, for example, existed also in colonialism, in phases where people still actually strived to have the kind of lifestyle we can afford today, because at some point the logic connecting the activity with the result was self-evident, right? You depended on a very specific political or military or social function that was just not as necessarily essentialistically defined, but it kind of showed you the role within that framework, right? And brought systems, communities to cooperate in a hierarchically ordered fashion, because more or less everybody knew what their place was, and there wasn't too much of a hypocrisy about that. Today that connection is lost, in part because we're not so immediately powerful anymore, because the average person has ceased to seek that even properly as a raison d'être, and the general crisis and kind of stagnation, if not recession, that system displays in many fields, many milieux, objectively discourages right? And someone was not being habituated to strive in the first place, so it immediately becomes like the difficulty becomes a superstition because nobody has taught that person to simply to overstep, like to tame it, to control it, to be above that, right? So objectivity in this sense cannot flourish, because if the individual is just concerned about what is happening in the immediate surroundings of him or herself, how can you why would you even try to expect some kind of value of any sort? And that's why historical objectivity or knowledge is lacking altogether, because how can you understand politics or war or society or cultures broadly meant, again, if your object of interest is just subjectivistically and relativistically self decline, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? In essence, the only way you have to become competent or intelligent or capable is making an enormous amount of work which you don't want to do and you're not going to do anyway, even though you have all the means that your ancestors had basically lacked constantly and by magnitudinal scale compared to what you have, and you have simply given that up. So for a historian like this, the problem of historical objectivity is surely very important, because you are exposed to crossfire like at every step of the way. Like when you write an article, this thing is going to be peer reviewed. There are going to be people reading you. Once it's out there, it's published, it's printed, there's not much you can do to change that. You can't write maybe another article, but if you made a very big mistake, well, that thing will be exposed in the future, and it's not really, let's say, it's how history, is built, actually. But at the same time, you have, in that sense, perhaps a motivation. You have a motivation there that derives at least from this level of pressure. That's why, given that many historians also are not motivated at all, if not by some kind of notoriety and this kind of vicious mechanism of call for papers, etc., that is at the end of the day finalized to you paying universities just to have an article published, because that's something that makes you get in formally into the academic selection. You just don't want to push historical inquiry that far, right? It's easy just to write an article, a new article about a certain topic, repeating essentially what others have said, essentially adding the criticism to what others have said, even maybe a positive one, saying, yeah, that's kind of that, but we still don't know this, we still don't know that, and yeah, okay, what did you add in this article? That's why there are entire parts of the world that are historically dominated, also from a cultural point of view, that in the last 50 years have produced nothing but rubbish on the entire line, right? From an academic, scientific point of view. And nobody kind of does anything. On the contrary, now new generations are being nurtured in that saying cultural temper, and they think that that's normal, right? Which is not. It's like the videos here. You may find what I say annoying by a certain degree. I know I'm boring the way I tell things, whatever, but factually I have some of the finest historical content here. Who is interested in listening to it? And I sympathize with that, because I don't use YouTube thoroughly as a viewer, but every day, let's say I want to watch my 10 videos, small ones or something specific that is just like I don't even put myself in front of here for anything. It's just maybe I'm working and tired, say, okay, let me take a break of this kind of funny sketch, or I don't know, let me hear this interview to this actor, this figure, to know what they think or what their mind. It's a form of history, but it's also a form of relaxation. I don't start to watch a 2 hours long video to I don't know, pretend that even the person who's talking is worth being listened to. And sometimes it's a mistake, because ideas are always ideas, and we are lazy also in that way. But that's the reason also in part because, why I have so few subscribers still myself, because evidently I don't make a kind of content that in spite of the quality, which I believe is not very difficultly, higher than the average, meaning that the average is so lame that it doesn't take anything to say something more historically sensible than the average, but is therefore too laborious, too difficult. It requires too much that the average person just doesn't give a damn about, by a certain degree, and that's it. The average layman, what can you do to be historically objective? Again, as I said before, you should accept that you exist in that realm within a framework which has a hierarchy in it, right? Doesn't mean that you should follow authority or just pretending that it's who knows what, just blindly so. But at the same time, a bit of humility towards the fact that, yes, that historian may be a moron, but you may easily be the same or much worse, right? And that maybe it's kind of the case on average, considering that still education does select competence abundantly in our system, contrarily to what also a certain type of conservatism that is completely, in fact, contrary to any form of tradition and universal values would like to make you believe. Like before, the elite was the only competent element in the community, and the levels of elite education that existed in the past today do not exist anywhere, right? Among even historians, right? So the elite of the world before studied humanities, right? So those conservatives say, you should just start a business because that's what cool people do. No, that's just a form of cultural underdevelopment, right? If you do not expect as a mature adult man to dominate history in a real fashion and not condensate in a bunch of cliches just to comfort your incredibly narrow, superficial, and irrelevant historical understanding, well, you should ask yourself what kind of how low in the hierarchy you actually figure, because again, that's also what fundamentally the whole thing is about. The same goes for those who pretend to study humanities without studying science, hard science, and or that in fact any form of knowledge basically is separated in a kind of a categorical way from another, right? This is also a crucial step to start from, to realize if you don't accept properly that it's the entirety you have to strive for, you can't even motivate yourself. You can't even properly give a dimension to what you're learning, and that's what you see on Schwerpunkt. After all, why do you follow me? You follow me because you see that I know a lot of different things, right? If I can't cover the entire medieval warfare in, I would say, fair detail, basically of any country in the world, and making infinite videos on it without any problem, as you see every day, the question is, you probably realize that gives me kind of a comparative and diachronic competence that you don't really find elsewhere. And after all, what do you really want? You do want this. You do want competence. You do want judgment, right? Historians, that's what I also wanted to talk about recently. Historians need to judge, right? Because otherwise, why do we have historians in the first place? Like, imagine you have a person who studies for years a certain subject, and should this person just be limited to observation? Of course, you have to observe to eventually evaluate something. And the reason why judgment is necessary is that reality is subjective. But in the measure I told you before, that is to say, it's subjective because you can't never know it fully. But exactly because you know more about that, right? Even if the standard was just a conventional one, it's still superior to what we have, right? So you want to know what that person thinks, also about what we still don't actually know, and what the next steps should be, because that's the judgment that you have to assess. Nobody has, what you would call in that absolutistic factual historical knowledge, right? Because it's an illusion, right? It's also one of the many tricks that, in fact, deterministic and relativistic historiography, especially after World War II, has kind of enforced you to think like. There's all a set of delusions that, even conservatively speaking, people think they are conservative points. They're actually engineered by socialistic ideologies, right? And they are actually created as a response to this, what the same, very often Marxistic ideology forced the others to think the world in terms of, right? Just calling yourself a capitalist is, essentially calling yourself as Marxists defined you in order to essentially to rob and kill you and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat that we don't even realize in practically what it should be, because history shows pretty well what actually happens, not just in the general disaster of communism, but also in the actual dynamics of how people can't be used to come to power, but what you need to make power work, etc., with all the repression later of the same elements. And so it's an illusion, right? The idea of objectivity is, let's say, the idea of subjectivity in itself is the first reason why objectivity exists and the truth exists, because it's not a fiction to make up for what we don't know. It's exactly what all the puzzle starts showing you the moment you are putting it together, and that evidently shows you a logic, a picture, a hierarchy, a functionality, something that goes towards that absolute. And traditional cultures had all sorted this out. We're not talking about traditional cultures like in the form of hunter-gatherers. I'm talking about properly traditional civilizations of the ones that dominated the world and that basically shared all the same ideology. Why? Because these were the ones that had made the effort to build up that system and also to keep it together. So both motivationally and also as in terms of reward. And that in that very divide, right, between those who made it and those who didn't, you can see, right, in the system of values, the actual ideology of the more advanced civilization over the one that didn't make it, right? This does still show, it's not, again, a categorical, it flows in a universal fashion through the same axioms that are as infinite as reality, but this reality does have a form, right? And the more you study it, the more this form shows up, right? So, as I was saying before, this cannot be seen easily until you make the work, right? It's a contradiction in terms. That's why so many people feel kind of depressed, demotivated today, and they abandon themselves to radical, in fact, morally subjectivistic ideologies, because nobody has ever taught them how to work. I mean, how to actually compose that picture, and not just being essentially a meaningless element of the wall, right? It's powerfully connected to the mind, but it's also an obvious consequence, let's say, of how the same systems eventually tend to transform themselves, like over time. There is always a relaxation. There is always a moment where nobody teaches others the point, but they forget it, right? And that's exactly what we have done in say, arguably and easily, in the most intense way in the history of mankind in the last couple of centuries, practically, and that we still strive to recognize, because again, we have been fed with the delusion that it would have been sufficient just to invent a bunch of stuff to solve the problem of existence, and of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with that. Right? If you don't have a moral force supporting your scientific knowledge, basically will not do anything useful with it. And that's why some ideologies that are essentially all of nationalist and socialist nature blended together, because essentially from communism to fascism to Nazism, those were all national socialism, all of them, and whoever still tries to tell you, no, because, that was different, it's not the same thing, blah, 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 blah. They're just exactly falling in the same trap. They cannot see that the categories that have been imposed on, and for no reason, are just deriving from this obsession of pretending that hypostasizing reality in something that you're not even proving in practical fact is the sole purpose. That is to say, alienating yourself, becoming a merely contemplative individual who reasons by abstractions is the answer to problems. Why, again, do I have the von Clausewitz avatar, right? And why I criticize Jomini's work, but also appreciate the fact that he admitted in the end that it was wrong and that von Clausewitz was right. Well, if you don't know the story, why are you even here, right? Why are you even here if you haven't listened to the von Krieger series? It's useless, right? You're pretending to find something here that I can't make for you, because the only person who can improve his or herself is you. Like, you're not responsible for the others. You're responsible for yourself. And what is the best of yourself that you can be? Have you ever answered that question? This is not the best of yourself, again, in the bullshit kind of categorical, hypostasized way, I don't know, make more exercise, or, eat this or that. This is about your power to transfigurate as a human being into something divine, which is at the base of the entire traditional universal beliefs. And guess why this was believed at the time? Well, if you haven't studied history, and if you haven't studied, of course, history of thought, religions, and culture, and anthropology, and this moral and scientific dimension is not, part of your constant life dichotomy, of course you cannot know. You will just think that's gibberish, that's, some kind of preachy, weird stuff about this guy believes, in something that doesn't exist. Of course, because you have never witnessed that. You have never even tried. You have never even begun to understand that. And there is a way, there is a path. I promise that if everything goes well, we continue this autumn, this winter, I will take very important steps in that direction, as I've done last winter, where when I was, in fact, in my own chaos, right, and I was kind of depressed in a generic sense, and I needed at that point to come back with a renewed spiritual force, and that we'll have to resume again, because this channel is exactly the same way. The more it grows, the more it cracks generic audience, and this generic audience doesn't have that form, right? It has substance as itself, but it's not formally ordered, and doesn't know what this channel is about. I still have subscribers that do not understand, in fact, that everything is interconnected, that these videos specifically, are not, less, they're not more or less important than any other video I make, even on something that appears so, historically secondary according to your own perspective. Because it's not, right? That's still, again, your perception kind of being arbitrarily imposed on a reality that is not that, right? That you think, because I'm behind this and I'm doing the thing and it has a very specific purpose, and I simply can tell you that it's not, right? This has nothing to do, of course, with the fact that you can consume my content in whichever way you want, but I'm simply telling you it's a waste of time if you haven't realized this, right? If what I'm saying right now you have not understood so far, doesn't matter how long you've been here, basically everything you have listened to is useless, right? It can't be useful, maybe just, again, for a minimal, a kind of lower grade, kind of inferior quality in the hierarchy, but it's not going to answer for you. And that's the point. We're all striving towards the top, towards the truth, and some go ahead, some just lag behind, and it's always going to be like that. There's never going to be equality, but that's exactly what makes us want to go on, right? And if you give up with so much, because simply it turns out that nobody told you. Again, this is the strange thing that, again, it shouldn't even be strange because it's very innerly coherent to the within properly the system. Is that if you're not spirited, if you're not motivated, if you're not morally loaded by a specific purpose, you will automatically fall into the dark pit, and you will practically, without any other stimulus, you will not be able to come out of it in a broader sense. And the bad news is that it takes a systemic commitment, right? It's not just sparking the interest towards history. It's not sufficient. I know people that read history for a lifetime, reading much more books than I do, and ultimately actually not understanding history at all, right? Not even remotely the way I can do. Why? Because I went beyond to a specific level that allows me to process anything else from the qualitative dimension of that level, right? It's not even providing me with who knows which astonishing historical understanding. You know that. Our videos are chats. I surely don't write history as I speak about it, especially on YouTube. But let's say I could easily make a video, and I made in the past also some already explaining some nuisances in the research, etc. That could be overwhelming. You say, wow, you actually do this in your life? Like, it sounds crazy, controlling thousands of references at a time, trying to keep them in mind. Yeah, because you can't do history otherwise at the levels that we have also come up with by this point. This is exactly the point I was telling about before regarding also the decline, that there are historians who were better than anything that exists today, and they knew less, but they knew better. Right? This is the actual deal, right? That we're exchanging in fact, the absolute with the relative, but also the substance with a form, right? You can read whatever you want, but if you don't give a form to it, if what you read is not put together, right, held together by a specific logic and view, that it's not arbitrary, it's not subjective, it's actually derived from the way you attrition with reality to get the sap of it, right, ingrained within yourself, right, osmotically. You can, again, gather all that information, but factually knowing nothing about that. It's like, think about WikiLeaks or all this stuff. Some people say, oh, wow, all this stuff will be released, even in other data that has been. But the question is, released en masse? Yes, but okay, but who is going to analyze it? And to which purpose? It's like privacy today on the internet. I'm kind of, reserved, as you know, but it turns out that the best way you can hide on the internet is actually being like the average, which is pretty promiscuously open and kind of showing off and exhibitionistic in its own kind. Because you can be very easily framed, you can be kept under control better, not by the terrible world conspiracy that wants, to I don't know even what they would want according to you, because I know that many conservatives of my audience are also kind of conspirationalistically, let's say, oriented in a way, just because of the conspiracy is a delirium that basically makes you feel as if you didn't have the burden of confronting yourself with reality, right? And that's also the other step, right? If you want to be objective about history, you have to learn how to process the thing yourself. Instead, we generally make up those logics in our mind just because we listen to somebody else making them and say, okay, this sounds kind of convincing for my, because I don't have time to learn anyway, so let's buy that. And that's sediments, and if you don't learn anything on your own, you will just remain at that level, and that very often is kind of a childish thing, and that has not even to do with the actual conspiracy theory. That may even be true, but it's not that you were right if that turned out to be true just because you believed in it blindly. You have no merit, right? It's like betting on 50-50 and saying because you thought that, I don't know, there was something about that half that is so meritorious or whatever, and then that side wins, maybe for completely different reasons, but you say, so you see, I was right about that. You kind of weren't, because you factually didn't know anything about it. Or even if you knew something about it, it's a completely unsatisfactory level of understanding through which you will not sort out even the simplest systems, let alone the much more complicated ones. I think even just as a high school student, you should have understood reality is basically made of, right? So let's just think about politics or war or society. It takes decades and decades to even just acquire that level of analysis for built on certain narrow examples in times and space. Nobody can cover the largest problems or issues, and there is in fact an important branch of philosophy of history that also von Clausewitz was part of in practice that is connected exactly to this, that the positivistic, progressistic idea that you can sort everything out just because you have this magic tool of science that will make it work by itself is actually an anti-scientific thought, right? The way we cope with reality is basically accepting exactly that we cannot know it, but that still there are certain phenomena of it that can be studied and can provide us with a certain literally sixth sense. It's a sort of synthesis that just our brain is capable of making. No machine will ever be able, even remotely, to possibly dream to replicate, and that has been designed exactly by nature in ways that we still don't understand especially anything about, because how we think or whatever, nobody knows anything about. We have just an incredibly tenuous understanding of how the brain mechanics is, what thought ideas are. Nobody has the palest idea of what the hell that is, the same including life and all moral forces broadly meant. So you can imagine this for just one individual, just imagine billions, and just imagine history and with all the problems of documentation, whatever. So there is a finesse there, as Descartes would have said, that you will acquire only through experience and through that meat-grinding pressure that you will have to go through in order to make sense of something that apparently doesn't have any. And that's exactly the only form of valid knowledge that you can achieve. If you're just, lost with your mind in the clouds, pretending that you can write a manual in which you can calculate our reality, you will be dead before you even realize it, and you will have not understood anything in absolute terms about the world, because everything that you were talking about was mere speculation, abstraction, detached from reality, and practically useless for anyone, right? And as you know, I think that history, and especially military history, have the highest value in this hierarchy, because they are exactly the ones that combine the greatest and most relevant dynamics for humans, and at the same time the same, say, degree of control, right, varying, and war, that's why I mentioned it, is ever more specific and interesting in that regard, to learn how to have a positive effect on it, but even just there probabilistically, not because it's not rolling the dice, you have to make the thing, but even there without ever providing you with anything like certainty that does not exist. So if you think, again, when you search on Google for certain historical stuff, you want facts, you should first train yourself in understanding like the myriad of facts that exist, and first of all, what facts you actually want to have, because a good synthesis, a good overview is still not even, say, the more it is so, and the more it's like kind of distant from the same historical work, because it's skipping all the problem of evaluation. And even though, yes, at the end of the day, those, as I was saying before, that are here to evaluate and to provide with a judgment should be listened to, especially by those that are not competent like them, still, that will not make the work for you. You will not have a magic knowledge that, because I've read it from that guy's book, so I know as much as that guy, right? Or another guy that basically has the same equivalent, around the same, say, competence of that guy, maybe disagrees with that guy. And so that's also one, in fact, of the most evident indicators of how few you know something. Like those people will sclerotically say, but I found in this book this guy saying this, so it's true, right? Even just a certain phraseology or even a certain terminology, like saying the use of specific words so that you can't feel yourself allowed to repeat it just because, it was written in that book. That means that out of that book, you basically know nothing, because you don't have any other judgmental capacity but the one deriving from a work written by someone who is also likely not going to show you how he got to that actual knowledge, because the most of history books that are read and just known today are, for example, devoid of the actual description of the sources, of the work on the sources. To make an example, like if I write an article, normally, like in a serious way, I'm just habituated to in note, at least to quote by extent what I'm referring to, so that the reader can understand exactly every step of the way which logical point I'm making, right? If you read a book that is just, the 200-300 standard, Anglosphere type of, of monography that uses just, a few notes, maybe quoting which kind of work this information is drawn from, and not even quoting the page or anything, and just the list of the sources is at the end, and throughout the whole book there is practically no reference to the systemic employment of this use of those that same bibliography. What will you actually know about how that author wrote that for, and what kind of judgment? And let's say, and there is also this aspect that there is a risk always in any form of historical assessment. So, as I was saying before, some historians tend to remain kind of safe grounds, not to, in part, to spare, potential object of, for, the subject of potential, further potential articles or things like that. Other times, probably not to show what kind of logical leap they made, because maybe it was pretty volatile. And I must tell you that it's pretty common. And just, again, it differs between countries in ways that you wouldn't even like to understand, because it's terrifying if you actually realize the basis on which most historiography rests on today, right? But it's also this attitude, okay, I don't want to, I will simply make it easy, like we don't know, right? This is typical of many historians, like it's difficult to understand this very complex issue. Well, it means that you don't understand shit about that. That's the only thing it means, because unless you literally don't have any source, and so you explain the fact that, okay, beyond this we have no idea, but still there is some room for, say, further, there's always some room for further appreciation, which is not that speculation I was talking about before, because reality is so complex that it always provides with some other elements to express other ideas. So that guy just maybe wanted to make a 300 pages work, right? Maybe for a good work it would take in 1200, but he wouldn't do that because it wouldn't even be published. And so that's how the book actually came to be and for you to read. And if you're not exposed to this, which is also a form of history itself, the facts you're searching for, even 300 pages book, let alone, what you can find in the aforementioned Google search, is still going to be insufficient for deconstruction of your own competence and judgment. So that objectivity, frankly, comes in the end just through the most obvious realization that lying to yourself is a pretty stupid idea. Because lying to other people is also a pretty stupid idea unless you basically want to get rid of them. They don't have any, role in your life. And even at that point, you could be simply straightforward and, making a service to the world at that point rather than just yourself or the other person. Teaching by example, which also we have lost in that kind of initial rigidity, like those memes that say, being too kind in this world is becoming always too difficult because people take advantage of you. Why do you have to be kind? What it means being kind, basically, being stepped over at every second, being serviceful for everyone, being lenient about everything, tolerating everything. What kind of model is that, right? In the moment in which you realize that there is an objectivity in reality and in history, you simply stop giving a fuck about anything. I can, that, right? It's in my videos I always say what I think, and the reason why some of you say, "Oh, Schwerpunkt, we like you because you're objective." Well, that's a great compliment you make, and I appreciate it very much. But I am objective exactly not because I take a specific position and then try to fit things according to that, right? We all do it by a certain degree, but the best thing you can do is exactly, even in these circumstances, accepting that you are in a certain place, that you know certain things, that you think they make sense for this and that reason, that you must be able to explain if you want to be, believed and considered reliable, but for yourself in the first place, because that's exactly the point. There is a community value around this, right? We're not historians for nothing. This thing serves to essentially teach people how to think straight, right? And this is not negotiable, again, because reality teaches you that. That's why I made that view on saying, why history makes you conservative, that you all liked and cheer and say, this is not to flatter you in saying, look, if you're a conservative, you're in the right squad, you don't have to, to worry about becoming a better person. This is because, okay, I have a specific view of the world that is strictly connected, however, with the aforementioned ideas that I objectively, again, assessed from a moral and scientific point of view relatively to the traditional universal values that nobody objectively told us in our, I think, more or less relatable Western background, in spite of the differences, naturally. And that still were there, and again, were discussed up to a very few generations ago, and that have basically also, in fact, nothing to do with what conservatives think they are today, but that are actually pretty insightful, and not just like a theory or something that you can come up, as a contemplative take on the world. It has a deep sense that is backed also by all the historical evidence that I've come across so far, properly in explicit meaning, not just in an interpretation, like, Soviet type of history, making stats or seeing how, things happen on the surface, dehumanizing, taking away the idea and the intention and the purpose and the meaning, and pretending that, the only way of making history is transforming it in a physics laboratorium. It doesn't happen like that, right? And so that's my way of being what I think is conservative, by a certain degree. I think the same term conservative, some of you ask me what you think about that. It's not even really relevant, right? Right now I'm mostly struggling with the idea of understanding really if that absolute truth has properly an oppositional value to this kind of political dichotomy, because left and right objectively also have a much, rather than vertical, actually a very strongly horizontal meaning that is is exactly part of the deterministic and relativistic axiom that that belongs to the chthonic, not to the Uranic dimension, and so it's anti-traditional and anti-universal, and that's exactly the point. But it also has to do with some important archetypes and anthropological and even sexual meanings that today want to be essentially destroyed by one side of the story, even though even conservatism is polluted with that, is poisoned with that, is basically rotten from the within, and it has practically no value to this point, and surely absolutely doesn't even approach remotely the idea of sacred and the kind of knowledge we're talking about here. But this is another thing. What I'm saying is that I just see no point of lying to myself, right? And that's what what becomes evident the moment to which you actually know the thing. There is a stage instead, and that's why what I was talking about also in that video about, in fact, how history makes you conservative, that fundamentally is still the learning phase, which would seem to me where most ideas today in the kind of liberal leaning, if not properly leftistic leaning orientation, that the chthonic masses, the fourth estate, surprise, that's why you talk about tradition and universality. These things happen all the time in the same way historically, and seem to be fed by. There is an active reason. It's not a strange sociological phenomenon that we have understand, the deep causes of. I mean, it's like this explanation is deep in its own way, but let's say it's also kind of self-evident, and the reason why it seems to be something complicated you can't really frame within a single explanation, man, because it's too complex. It's just, again, a full talk about, not seeing what even just 100 years ago would have been self-evident to an average person. And that not even at the time the average person was particularly bright anyway, and it has all a specific meaning. Again, that is being lost, that we've been distracted from, and purposely so, I believe. If anything, that's the only conspiracy I believe, really, because it's not really even a conspiracy. It's it's well known and well studied, but also it does happen through the same depletion of values that this active purpose really goes, and also with the general unavoidable aging of the world that is also a physical principle, not really a matter of personal opinion. That's why I always say it's moral and scientific alike at the same time, because they actually overlap, right? If you wonder where wisdom or the verbum or the logos come from as ideas, that's the same concept. And again, this anxiety of categorization came out only a few hundred years ago, and it was just fueled by the need of classification, not the need of properly giving a comprehensive form to this substance, right? But just finding some criteria that you could crystallize so that people wouldn't have to think on how to make. And so that killed the entire, in fact, moral and scientific background. It's not surprised that, through the revolutions, statalism, collectivism, things like nationalism and socialism came out, because that's the chthonic mass that spreads that individually annihilating ideology that has destroyed basically I would say, a good part of human worth nowadays. I go as far as that, because I believe that human worth does exist, and it's not just the potential, again, that we attribute to it. It can be powerfully motivationally speaking, but it's not enough. Like, people mostly, there are people who are worthier than others, properly as humans, right? And there is no doubt about this there. But in any case, the objectivity for the layman, it can remain a nebulous area, and I know it's an issue, but again, as for everything, if you really want to discern that, there is no shortcut. You must work. hard, and you can't just be you can come up with interesting questions and ideas and perspectives, but that doesn't mean they are right, nor, and that's the point. If you are still asking for objectivity, you're the first one who's wondering whether that's the case, right? And in any case, again, avoiding that step because maybe it's emotionally disturbing is not really, doesn't really legitimize you to fall again into the subjectivistic dimension where you say, well, then whatever I think, it's my truth, because truth doesn't belong to anyone, right? Really, and so it's not even, there is not a truth, but there is only the truth, and the rest basically has no relevance. The more it distances itself from it, it's that simple. For everything, that's in terms of merit, of power, of anything, right? There is not an absolute dichotomy. There is only an absolute truth, and that's what we have been dishabituated to reason like, and it's going to cause some of the greatest problems to our civilization in ways probably I've not seen before. And objectivity naturally can be, history is very political in nature, so objectivity is naturally a chimera in the fullest sense, exactly because we don't own the truth, but we can, of course, improve always along that path, coming closer to it. And we know politically that we are programmed to essentially to react in a much more direct and often unthoughtful way whenever this subject is brought about, and so everything about a very important step to start being objective is digging in our own mind, right? Because politically wise, and this is broadly psychological in nature, it affects any corner of our mind. Deep inside, we know what is wrong. Like, we know what is that we are making up without proof, just to support an idea that we think is good, but we have not investigated yet thoroughly, right? And again, that, as I will explain in that other video, this often coincides with your early adulthood, like you say, the first half of your 20s, where you're probably also biologically designed not to be mentally objective as you would come to be later, and that people confused by, the older people sclerotized, they can't think anymore openly. This is not the case, right? In part it's true, but it doesn't mean that it's not functional to a process that, and in fact does include also that more emotional moment in your earlier time, and that is meant to functionally happen all together, right? So also say you can generationally oppose various groups for cultural reasons, because of course things happen, but let's say your personal path should be timely. But the human mind is flexible enough to do this, to learn at every age. But still, if you want really to use the big guns and fulfilling your potential, well, you should be wary of the fact that there is this phase in your life where you're not just going to learn more in a sense, but also you're going to lie to yourself more. Because if you weren't open to lie to what you already know, or to put that in discussion, you wouldn't learn, right? So it's crucial at that point for you to still be aware, of course, of what you integrate in your own baggage of knowledge, but at the same time, you should be aware that that's the moment in which you're probably going to feel the most disappointed eventually at this exercise at the same time, because at that point, by bringing all in, you still don't have an effective criterion to sort things out, right? In a hierarchical sense, you want to learn more rather than be able to judge, right? And so you're going to lean also towards kind of a more, in fact, more kind of Dionysian sense. But that ends at a certain point, and it's on the base of that you should mature, right? Remaining perennially stuck in life to this, ever question everything for the sake of just of annoying, right? Of tearing down, of being an iconoclast. It's more like a mental disorder that doesn't fit really your biological rhythm. It's just an ideology. You intoxicated yourself, an autoimmune disease, and a mode of being that actually shows that you did remain kind of like a stupid boy, and you didn't move on. And there's nothing worse than seeing, in fact, full, mature adults still displaying those characteristics. And that's why also in traditional and universal world, there was no, these were the fools, the lesser people. They were the ones that were brought under and very often made also a pretty shady end, because they were the dysfunctional element that objectively nobody needs at that level of hierarchy and competence, and that endangers the rest of the community. So when this again becomes just a mode of being, it's just, leftistic lifestyle mode, which is never, throughout all your own existence, which is also never possible fully, because in fact most leftists eventually turn out, conservatives by, their middle age, right? Surprise, surprise, right? This is again completely normal, but doctrines, ideologies, propaganda, especially lack of that moral force, still will make you ever more exposed to this. And this is, again, exactly what is happening today. And that's actually the reason why we say, you've probably fed with this lie that we are progressing, in the form of saying, just think about your leftist grandfather thought, and it would be like a radical conservative today. Well, it's kind of obvious because, again, the world at some point was much more, concretely oriented and kind of much more connected to causes and consequences just by sheer experience of action than cheaper thought that unavoidably makes you ever more lenient and less culturally resistant. This is what we know about essentially the entire history of mankind, right? That moral force and superiority that can easily be extended to cultures altogether do show that the cultures that are capable of less effort, not because they're born like it, because culture always changes and evolves, right? So that's how, tribes can become empires, etc. But exactly show the fact that those who achieve more are better than the others, right? There is no doubt about this, because it's a moral discriminant making the difference. It's not a preset condition. That's why culturalism is a danger, because it has hypothesized culture as if culture was not constantly changing and providing with those differences that in order for you to be competent or understanding or whatever, culturalism, as you know, is mostly, at least I've met it mostly as a counter Clausewitzian theory and all the, that as garbage, in fact, but still it's branched in other subjects and disciplines. Say is first of all, it's false. It's not evidence basically by anything that we discover every day about humanity, but it's exactly that kind of more lenient and kind of flat leaning that would like to make you think that there is just a simple dichotomy in reality, where, for example, violence is not understood as a mean but as an end, right? And I don't know what kind of person, even just say, I think if you ask a child, it will tell you otherwise, because again, before you're filled with this garbage in your mind by someone else, and lured into some game that maybe, I don't know, it's also based on reward, on interest, or kind of money, but at a certain point, there is no way you would believe that, even just intuitively, right? Not meaning that intuition is is always right, or even right majority of the time, but let's say certain things easily that we also come to understand after that phase where our prefrontal cortex solidifies finally, is that most of what we believed as children and as adolescents before that crazy first half of the 20s actually worked. And the reason why it worked, you know why it worked? Because your parents, that were mature people by that time, had taught you. And at that age, children are made to absorb wildly what you give them. And that's why they are the best investment that we could have to fix civilization. Nobody gives a damn, and schools are simply a joke, are just like, if you send, a bunch of cows grazing in the grass, it would be basically the same way of, saying children go to school like it today, right? It's a complete waste of time. Like, not quite in the sense that you shouldn't send them to school, but let's say the actual teaching, right, the doctrinal part, is basically non-existent, right? And also that is, as you know, politically controlled, or at least they try to control it in one way or another. It's not a surprise. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's always been like that. It's always been a forever, in fact, ongoing struggle. Just today, it seems to reach proportions, unprecedented proportions, because of this moral collapse. Because parents today, let's be honest, they shouldn't even be parents, right? If it wasn't for demographics, yes, but just for producing slaves that will be completely worthless individuals. Because with that kind of, of familiar background and upbringing, frankly, I don't know where we're going to go. And so I'm very convinced of this because, step by step, I see it confirmed. And this is an interesting part of the story, because we say, well, with Schwerpunkt, people who are generally very biased tend to reason in a way which wants to see confirmed their own pattern. Well, it's not about, the problem of pattern or an ideology. It depends on which one it is, right? So, again, don't apostatize knowledge, because that's the first mistake they want to make you do. It's not that I'm saying confirm this because, I need to make it fit, right? It's like when I write an article. I would like my articles to be always like, I knew at the beginning what I wanted to write, what to expect, and I found something in the midst of it that kind of had to make me change the whole thing. I'm habituated to that idea because I know how to publish serious, objective things. So with my life, of course, you can say that in your mind you tend to be more lenient and lazier, and that we are all doomed anyway because of the twilight of the gods and original sin, and the end of times and everything. But let's say, and that is true, right? It's true also scientifically speaking, and nobody cares apparently. But also in the broader civilizational view of the great progress and achievements that we would allegedly reach in the Valley of Tears, the question is rather, what is, again, what's the matter? What are we talking about? Because without that, you can't verify. That's why history is based on an inquiry, and that's why, the police makes investigations, and why we want to find out what, not the truth is, but at least what it's, a satisfactorily valid approximation in what happened in reality, because we don't have any other way to go. And there is a moment, in fact, the moment of the decision, the moment of judgment, that requires all the best of ourselves, and that cannot be performed without that enormous, not just quantity, but properly quality of knowledge and understanding. And again, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, don't flatter yourself, because all the steps of the way, you're seeing how you fail by a certain degree. But it's by failing that you achieve that result, right? By realizing that if you failed in a way, what counts there is not what you lost in terms of actual damage, if you want even just material damage, time and resources wasted, but in the moral dimension that we have been prevented from even just assessing in our ideal, that instead because of that is capable of redrawing, reassessing, of reorganizing your thoughts and providing you with a function that you had never seen before, and that it's just a form of sensitivity and again of intuition, of rationale, of something that you are going to recognize again, so that you will not make the same mistake again. So that will have improved your capacity to better, right? And again, it never ends. So there is never a point of arrival. If you think that any belief that you have, whichever it is in your life, is a point of arrival, just know that it's not. Right? Just know that you're essentially throwing in the towel. And you say Schwerpunkt, but then also your view about the truth and the hierarchy is not. So far, everything I've learned points toward that direction. And the more I learn, the better this thing gets defined. So my point is not saying that everything can change. Again, that would be a relativistic thing. It's again about the idea of the half filled and half empty, half full and half empty glass, right? If I told you that this thing is taking form because I see it, and I had to describe that form, it would be very complicated to do. But my mind sees it, right? And sees it in all the things that I'm gathering and analyzing. So this doesn't mean that the glass is not there, that that there's not a certain amount of water in the glass, right? Finding out exactly how much and seeing this and how it affects our existence, what we can do about it, it's the most complicated thing in a sense, in an existential sense, in a moral sense, in a scientific sense, but it shouldn't distract you from the fact that there is something out there and that it is taking form. And so opinions are not important because they are yours. Opinions are important because they are reflected by reality, and you have the capacity of seeing that. So yes, I do believe in that system. I do believe in what I see, right? And the more I see and the more I believe, and this is the beauty of that, because the more I learn and the more I see that. So it's not something self-constructing itself as just as a game in my mind, learning by heart some strange, random numerical series. This is gathering information from the reality as I know it. And what else do I have, right? So the more you learn in that direction, the more objective I think you become, because nothing escapes really that view. And I presume that the reason why people are skeptical about this is because, again, they haven't been there, right? They have reason in too abstract and or categorically interested direction to not actually concentrate on reality that is just in front of them. And in fact, all the mistakes you do, in a way, given that you become ever more capable, seem ever more stupid mistakes, right? Which, in the sense that, they're more stupid in relative terms to what you're doing, right? How did you come up with that prejudice that make you inform your otherwise massive knowledge about a certain specific field? Well, because I had never thought about that, and exactly the fact that I kept researching that field at the end of the day made me crush against that reality that maybe it's tiny, but it can make a difference in the system. That's why we study history for, and what the general ethics of it all really gets down to. And you can't really see more than that, because again, yes, it's very complicated to sort everything out, and so our poor cognitive means really do not make us go very far. Indeed, you can feel all the limit of your finite condition, but this still doesn't mean that what you learn is, is useless, especially when you understand how, what it implies factually. And when you see that nobody around you understands that because they haven't even began to address that, it's not subjective, because when you study history, you don't study just, I don't know what this pen is about. You study what humans do altogether. So it's something that, by its scale of relevance, doesn't matter how, relative in a sense it is to the time and place, etc. But, that's why also the more you know, in interest of time and comparatively, and the more that is relevant. Because you're not, again, concerning yourself with just a random thing, whichever it is, a sort of random profile here. What is that this person cares about? Let's see: skiing, rollerblades, archery, art like any art really. I'm quoting something. Cycling. How can these things, aside from some kind of control on your body and reflexes and fitness, can actually help you understand the complexity of major political, military, and social systems for you to be, an influent, a relevantly informed citizen. You see what I mean, right? And every of these profiles I click on, they're saying basically the same things, and none of the things I'm saying right now. So that's why I think that this has value and should be. It's not my opinion versus I don't know, vanilla and somebody likes lemon or whatever. Just threw it randomly there. It's evidently a massively and macroscopically hierarchical difference that is being traced there. So it's not just an absolute value, it's a qualitative value that's being drawn there, and that's what you should be searching for. And in my experience, history provides you with this. So objectivity starts essentially from this realization, and so far, I don't know, maybe I'm limited. I'm open to the idea that there is something else that I don't know, right? And that there is a lot that I have to learn, and that it would be mind-blowing. And I've seen it over the years, step by step. I could make a story of that, but it wouldn't be particularly interesting unless you can maybe see it through Schwerpunkt itself, these 4 years. But let's say it's I don't know. To me, it encompasses everything I can count. So I think it's a pretty good model of description that I not just can assess in, again, an abstract sense, but I can see in people's minds relating to, right? In the form mostly of its absence, unfortunately, but still in the understanding of why that absence is there, right? Or better, that thing lacks. So I don't know. That's my take on it. It's just a reflection on the objectivity in history. We can talk about such things more at some point if you're interested. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.